And what a dummy! Welcome back to the Fantasy Rugby Draft podcast. Thanks for downloading and listening. I'm Bruce Wilkinson, and joining me for the first time in 2017 is the man primarily made of moss, Nathan Mossman. Welcome back.
That's how excited I am. I couldn't even wait for the intro to finish.
I know, I like that. I like it. I did have a YouTube, like one of those party poppers to go off, but that failed. So you're just going to have to do with the Mossman clapping. How's your pre-season been?
As you know, actually, my season never really ends.
You're always on?
That's right, yeah. There's no off season for me. There's no off switch.
Nice. In today's pod, I think what we'll try and do is we'll keep it fairly light. We're going to have a few folks who are new to the product and new to the podcast as well. So we want to just look at some general kind of fantasy rugby draft principles. We'll look at a little bit about the online draft. We'll discuss a few things about the changes to the site. There's a little bit of gameplay stuff that you need to know. We've taken a bit of your feedback on board and put it back into the site, so we'll touch on those. And also some key talking points to factor into your rankings and your draft day. Again, apologies to the regular downloaders. This is probably going to cover a lot of old ground, but yeah. As most of you have already been doing, hit us up on the normal routes if you want to ask some specific questions around strategy and team naming and all that kind of stuff. Before we get into all of that, you can hit us up on Twitter, Fantasy Rug Draft, that's Fantasy RUG Draft, or on Facebook, or drop us an email at support@fantasyrugbydraft.com. And we can go from there. There's lots of interest so far, but the big one is about rankings, big question mark about rankings, but we'll get into that in a little bit. First of all, let's get into the product itself. So I'll come to you in a minute, Mossman, for some tips on Fantasy Rugby Draft, but I wanted to really emphasise the first point, which seems an obvious one. We've named the company after it, Fantasy Rugby Draft. So know when your draft day is. So if you're joining a league for the first time, if you're creating one for the first time, make sure you get that draft day as a date and a time where folks can join, and as many folks can join as possible. And if you're doing it online, sure, but if you're doing it offline, even better to have as many folks in the same room as possible, in the pub or down at the rugby club or something like that. But we've added a countdown timer now on the league homepage, so you can't miss your time. It should be fairly obvious to you exactly where you need to be and at what time. But I can't stress that enough. Draft day. Know when your draft time is. What about you, Mossman? What do you think your key tips are as a seasoned veteran of Fantasy Rugby Draft?
Well, you're definitely right about the draft day. Obviously, that's the key thing. But I think even for people that I think it's worthwhile just turning up, and even if you can't say commit to the whole draft, like at least turn up, make a few picks, especially the early ones, and you'll kind of feel like that's your team, that you own that team. And loads of people do end up with auto-drafted teams, and they still play and they still really enjoy it. But if you really want to get that full experience, like you feel like you really own that team, then if you make those picks yourself, it feels like you've got that ownership, and so I think that's really key.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Players getting auto-drafted, Bowden Barrett, and then boasting how well he's playing. It's a bit of a dichotomy. It's like, yeah, that's my pick.
Yeah, well done.
Yeah, good job.
Yeah.
And you pointed out the first pick is important as well. What do we always say? You can't win your fantasy rugby draft in your first round, but you certainly can lose it if you screw it up. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think moving on past the draft, I think as a game, it's one of those that you need to be a little bit more engaged perhaps than you do with certain other types of fantasy games, because there's various things that are going on during the week. There's the waiver wire, there's free agents, there's team namings, there's various things going on. So in some ways it's a more all-encompassing, more absorbing experience than perhaps just turning up on a Friday and saying, yeah, I'm just going to set my team. You kind of need to be, if you want to get the most out of it, you kind of need to be a little bit more onto it and looking for those key things that are happening during the week.
Yeah, exactly. And you picked on a key point. If you want to get the most out of it, great. But if you want to win, you certainly need to be doing that. If you want to really show up your boys or show up your league, then you need to be monitoring who gets injured. Look at the team news that come through on Thursday. It's an interesting one with the Aviva Premiership. I was going to touch on it a little bit later, but I thought I'd mention it now. It's a little bit different to Sanzar in the way that they name their teams. So they name their teams on a Thursday at lunchtime and a Friday at lunchtime, depending on who's playing on Friday, Saturday, Sunday. And they all are named at the same time. So there's a massive bounce and spike in the site when everybody gets these team news. And one of the boys described, I think Sam Roberts described it as the great trolley dash. You know, everyone's just running down the aisles, trying to find available flankers, putting it in their trolley. It's certainly much more focused at a certain point in time, whereas Super Rugby teams, they get named at various stages during the week, from anything from kind of Wednesday through maybe even after Friday. We've seen sometimes with the Hawaris teams. But yeah, keep an eye on it. You can't just log in on Monday, check your result, and then check out on Friday and set your team. There's areas that you need to be involved in during the week as well. Where your mates draft day this year, Mossman? Where are you headed?
Bris Vegas, actually. We'll be there for the tens.
Very nice.
So it's quite the weekend event, really. There's a series of things organised. There's obviously the draft, but even before the draft, we're drawing the draft order. We're drawing the conferences. All of this coming out of a hat to avoid any hint of impropriety, as was accused in my direction last season. And what's the other thing? Oh yeah, trophy presentation. Unfortunately, yes. I kind of forgot that one because the trophy's not coming to me.
Now, did said winner of said trophy manage to change his team name in time before the end so that it says Hugh Jones Massive?
I think I might have noticed that. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. For those that were playing last season, you'll be all too familiar about how many matchups Hugh Jones won in the grand final. It's an interesting point though. So we've got our office one up at Matakana. We're going to a winery up there, having a bit of a day of it, and then spending a night doing our draft and getting a few of the folks Skyped in from Turkey and Skyped in from the UK and Hong Kong. And that's what we that's what we recommend. You know, that's where the fun's to be had, is where you can look someone in the eye and then see them draft Andre Pollard in the first round when he's been injured out for the season. That's where you get the most fun.
Yeah, absolutely. And then just perhaps to explain that to those newcomers, that's an offline draft.
Sure.
So that's something where you're doing it, putting the results into a spreadsheet, and it's a spreadsheet that you can download off the site, gives you the format, and then later on you upload that spreadsheet back into the system. And there's two kinds. So there's that's the offline draft, and then online, which is done purely through your browser, logged into the site.
Yeah, no, good point on that. So I'm actually going to institute a new rule for our office league, and I was trying to institute it retrospectively to the last place finisher, to the Sacco essentially. But the person who finished last wasn't going for it. So the rule is going to be you have to wear the other half's dress, and the name of the street that you have to stand with a sign is decided by the winner. So you can kind of understand why it was retrospectively turned down, but hopefully we'll all sign off that in the next draft, because there's one thing winning, but it's another thing to be able to point and laugh at the person who became last.
It's absolutely fair though to not agree to that retrospectively. Well, only because you could quite legitimately claim that I would have tried harder if I knew this is what was going to happen.
That's true, or less. As the case may be, depending on your persuasion. Okay, let's get into some specifics around how we think you should prepare for Fantasy Rugby Draft. And from my perspective, it's all around preparation, and it's all about getting yourself into a very kind of known position going into your draft. So the key to that, and a big input into that, is being able to create your own rankings. So we usually release the rankings at the same time as we open the Super Rugby leagues, but we haven't this season. And one of the reasons we haven't done that is because we're trying to take the learnings from the Donald Trump Brexit echo chamber, in that we want you to create your own rankings. We don't want you to just listen to the folks around you or listen to the site and look at the rankings they have. We want you to come up with your own rankings, have a good crack at it first, the first couple of weeks, and then we want you to do your own. So not just positional rankings, which is obviously the starting point, but also start trying to break up in those positions into tiers, okay, I'd be happy with these top 3 fly halves, and then I think there's a big gap to the 4th one, because that comes in handy in your draft when you're at the bottom of that tier and you're thinking, okay, I'm happy with the next, say, 6 fly halves. I could go and grab the top loose forward, or grab the top midfield, or depending on how you want to do it. That way you can make a decision to say, okay, I've got a few picks in front of me. I'm pretty sure that by the time it gets back to me, I'll have one of those guys, and I'm comfortable sitting with one of those guys. So just remember, get some rankings, because 90 seconds goes really, really quickly, and you'll be surprised how pressurized and how anxious a time it actually is drafting, and you want a really stable environment, and having something like the rankings to be able to draw into just makes your decision a lot sounder, and you know exactly where you're going to go, because stuff goes wrong. Everything goes wrong in a draft. You think players are going to come to you, you're wrong. You have to expect the unexpected, and the only way to really kind of balance that out is make sure that you're clear in your head where you go with your rankings. What about you, Mr. Mossman?
Yeah, the rankings one's an interesting one, and I know from having looked at the stats that people's selections are heavily influenced by the ranks that they see. And a thing I'd just really like to emphasize to other people is that we don't claim to know everything by any means. And
carry on.
Well, the thing is that obviously the rankings are majority of that comes from your good self, and yet we don't have any evidence really to suggest that the way you've ranked things are any better than anyone else could come up with. You know, we're still very early on, I guess, in the whole product, and as a whole concept for Super Rugby. So what that means is it's entirely possible that there's a completely different system out there that you could use, a completely different theory that actually could be a winning theory, and you could beat a lot of people that are using perhaps the on-site rankings by going in a different direction. And I think we'll probably touch on it in a later podcast or cover it in a bit more detail. But I've got a theory of my own that is a little bit different to yours. And that's going to be really interesting. And mine's based on what I would call value-based drafting. So where I try to rank the players based on where I think their value is relative to baseline players in certain positions. And I know, having looked at it, that it does come out quite different perhaps to what you've got. So it's going to be really interesting to see. Hopefully I can encourage people to perhaps implement either their own theory or come on board with me. And and it's going to be a little bit of a clash of cultures in some ways.
So I'm assuming that theory either involves a dress on Great North Road or Hugh Jones drafted in 1 overall. I think it's an absolute valid point. Is that we do our best to be able to provide you folks with rankings, and they're a direction that we'd like to go in. But not only do we not know everything, but stuff moves so rapidly in the pre-season in Super Rugby. I mean, just looking at the Brumbies fly half situation as an example, you know, that could make or break quite a few people's drafts as well. And we don't have as much information as, say, other tournaments might have at this point in time. So, yeah, please do create your own rankings. You talked about value-based drafting there. That's a concept that a lot of kind of folks that have played this game before would understand, but for folks who are new to A, the podcast, and B, the product, do you want to just give a kind of cliff notes around that?
Well, I did actually briefly, obviously you weren't listening, because I did actually say that it is based on ranking players based on a baseline player. So it will be, you take that baseline player, you will look at the projected scores for players in that position versus that baseline player, and then once you take away the baseline from the projection, then you can get effectively like a variable that you can compare across positions. And so, and to summarize it, it might be, to actually use an example, it might be something like, well, okay, Beauden Barrett's going to score 330, 340 points. And that's fantastic. That's a lot of points. That'll be right up there amongst the highest point scorers. But say the 10th ranked, fly half, he might score 250. And so, okay, you've got a difference there of, 80 to, 90 points. Mm-hmm. Whereas the top rank front row, which could be the Lions, we suspect, will be right up there, probably score a similar number of points. 340. They scored 350 last year, so it couldn't even be higher. But what's the 10th ranked front row going to do? Well, it's not going to be anywhere near 250 points. It's going to be a lot longer. So that advantage that I get from taking a front row in that position is greater than what I would get by taking a fly half. And that's what I mean by value.
Yep. It's a good shout. And that's the key. Everything is around value. So you may think that, let's say Richie Mo'unga is a good example from last season, right? We had him coming into the season fairly highly when it came to draft day. But by and large, and we thought he was going to be in the top kind of 3 or 4 fly halves, but by and large, you didn't have to draft him as the 3rd or 4th. And you need to know as well what his value is in your draft. So you need to look around. If you're drafting with Crusader fans, then it's likely that they had wind that Richie Mo'unga was there and thereabouts and could be good. So he's likely to go a little bit earlier in your drafts. But if you're doing it with, say, South Africa, Australia folks, he was a fairly new player on the scene, so you might have been able to wait till maybe the 3rd, 4th round and snare him in that position.
And that's another example, because based on rankings, you had Marty McKenzie last season, well above him, and Marty McKenzie was going a lot earlier, up to 4 to 5 rounds earlier. Now clearly, if you went against the rankings and took Mo'unga instead, maybe you took both, but if you got him instead, then you were laughing, and that's what you need to be doing: is don't take the rankings as gospel. Think about it yourself.
Yeah, and even to peel back another layer and to pile on top of that, I mean, you just have a look at my teams last year that I played in all the leagues with you, Mossman, right? So I had Richie Mo'unga, and that was because the rankings were as of the start of January, or actually at that time they were in the middle of December. So that was when we were looking at Marty McKenzie and didn't really know what was happening. But by the time draft had come round, he was there, and he was on all my teams, and I was pulling him in, say, the 2nd or 3rd round. So it's just a point to know that those exactly that. The rankings aren't gospel. Create your own, and even create some to try and find some contrary positions, because that's where you get your sleepers. Another kind of notion in a draft as well is trying to hold your nerve when there's a big run of a certain position. So you might be drafting at, let's say you're last in the 2nd round, and you're expecting quite a few midfielders to be there, and the 5 midfield picks in front of you are all midfielders that you wanted. That's where your tier becomes really important, to know that, okay, am I happy with the 6th midfielder at that position, or should I actually pivot? At that point, should I go for my top loose forward? Should I go for my top front row? Or what should I do? And quite often, the value is actually zigging when others are zagging. So when you have that run, is to go a different direction, because you'll soon put a quick stop on it. Drafts are fairly reactive entities, in that when someone starts to go in a different position, they start doing that run in a different way. So if you started looking at, say, a loose forward, you'd be surprised how many other loose forwards start ticking off the clock, off the board pretty quickly after that. And the last one I wanted to kind of mention, Mossman, I know you've talked about this before. What about out of position players? That's a thing, right?
It's definitely a thing. And the stats from last year showed that. If you looked at some of the top players that were on teams that made the playoffs, it included players like Jed Holloway, who was a lock that was playing number 8. And I guess one thing we should mention once again to those newcomers is that players playing out of position, so a lock, for instance, playing at loose forward, they're just naturally in a position to score more points, because loose forwards, they carry more, they're more ball handling. Same goes for midfielders who end up playing in the back 3. Usually those outside backs, the back 3, especially fullbacks, they get some extra points from cheap return meters from kicks that midfielders don't generally get, and that's why having a midfielder, and Zas last year was an example of this, is a midfielder who ends up playing on the wing. Well, for a start, he's going to get those cheap return meters. He's also more likely to be on the end of a backline and score tries, so there's some added value in there. And I guess while we're talking about when we're looking for players that are scoring points, an obvious one is goal kicking. Goal kicking is just another feather in a player's cap, really. It's certainly not be all and end all, but it's a really good thing to have. And so if you can find, generally we expect it of fly halves, but if you can find players in other positions that are doing goal kicking, then you could really be onto a winner. And in the past, Mike Harris has been a great example of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to lift on that, there's only really a couple of players that I can think off the top of my head, fly halves, that you really could slot into your position and draft that didn't take kicks, and that would be Aaron Cruden and probably Ehire West. That they create their own shot, if you will. So there's an interesting stat, actually. I don't know if you picked this up today. So the news with Cruden going to... I'm actually surprised you're not in mourning. Are you wearing black at the moment?
I'm always wearing black. What do you mean?
Sure, it's slimming. Montpellier, so he signed for $10,000 million or whatever it was. But he the Chase Sport, I think, is handled. And I'm sorry, I butchered that. But he had a great stat that said that last year in Super Rugby 2016, Aaron Cruden... 9.2% of the time, 9.2% of his passes either resulted in a try or a line break. The next down was like Sopawanga at 6, and Bowden Barrett was 5, and Mwanga was like 3 or 4% or something. It was really quite telling.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I mean, I did see that stat, and I did think it was interesting, and I think if you just anecdotally said to somebody, I mean, who do you think is a more creative player in terms of passing, Cruden or Barrett? I think there's no doubt it's Cruden. Mm-hmm. You know, he's got that reputation as an offloader, and but of course, stats like that, they could indicate other things as well, couldn't they? I mean, we don't know how often he's actually handling the ball or in the positions that he is handling it.
I had a couple of theories on it as well.
Yeah,
like if you looked at the Hurricanes midfield and you looked at the Crusaders midfield, not nearly as good as Fekitoa, Anton Leonard-Brown and Charlie Ngatai. So, who is really creating that gap? Who is creating that line break? Is it Cruden, or is it the guy outside him actually is forcing that line break? So, yeah, stats tell two sides of the story, but I'm sure, what do they say? This, you can conjure up a stat to prove any point.
Yeah. I mean, if Cruden had Fonatier outside him, the stats might have been different. You could put him into the hole and still not make a line break. So,
I'm glad we got Seta Tamanavalu this season. Okay, so that's probably... So, you did mention something there that I wanted to raise to newbies as well, is that fullback is quite a valuable position in Fantasy Rugby Draft. He gets those cheap return meters, and certainly from a Super Rugby perspective, he gets 10, 15 before he hits that front line and he runs back. So I think if there's one thing you take away from this is that take a look at those fullbacks and those outside back positions. We're going to have a run of competition this year as well. So what we wanted to do is we figured that the people who know our product the best are probably the best people to kind of encourage others to join the product. So we're going to do a bit of a refer a friend, and we're going to put a bit of stash on the line. So if you invite someone to your league and they subsequently join up and register, you'll go in the draw to win a Super Rugby jersey of your choice. I'm going to say choice. I don't mean Crusaders or Chiefs. I mean your choice. So make sure you do that on the site. We'll put out an email a little bit later on as well. But yeah, we just want to see our managers, our big spokesmen. They know the product and they know what works. So we figured that you're our secret assets out there. So get inviting and go into draw to win that sweet stash.
Just on the subject of talking about competitions, one of the changes, I guess, to Fantasy Rugby Draft over the last 6 months or so, which probably perhaps wasn't noticed by a lot of people who just play Super Rugby, is the fact that we also include the Aviva Premiership competition now as an option to play in that league. Now, I personally I haven't been playing in any leagues related to Aviva, but I am intrigued to know from your perspective how you think that has gone, and what it's like, say, compared to playing Super Rugby.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. It's a very different beast than Super Rugby. It's a long season. They play 18 game weeks, and then it goes into 21. Round 21 is your grand final. And there are lots and lots of interruptions. So Champions Cup, Six Nations, LV Cup, America's Cup, World Series, Super Bowl, it's all in there. There's just so many interruptions that it's really difficult to build momentum and really implement a strategy, because you think you've got it down packed and you think you've got it nailed, and then someone gets injured in the autumn internationals, or someone's rested for a Champions Cup game coming up. It's a much different, but it's completely engrossing because it's such a slog. I had a terrible start in the North versus South League that I was doing with Rugby Mag. I drafted Tuolangi and Owen Farrell, and neither of them played for the first, I don't know how long, but I was behind the 8 ball. I think I lost my first kind of 5 or 6 matches, but I'm still in with a shout because it's such a long season and you only need to get that 4th spot. So it is a different beast in Super Rugby, and comparatively Super Rugby is blindingly fast and such a quick competition, and it's gone before you know it. I mentioned it a little bit earlier as well, and it's a bit of a bugbear of mine, and listeners of previous podcasts will know what I'm going to be referring to, and it's to do with team naming. The Premiership is obviously the Premiership is a professional league. They name their teams, as I said, at the same time. Obviously time zones help in that scenario, but it's much more professionally managed than the other competitions that shall remain nameless. Rhymes with Windsor, but obviously someone's had a word to them about certain aspects that could trip them up down the line, and you very rarely see players that are injured, for example, post the team naming. So gambling in the UK obviously is a much more accepted and managed proposition that it is in this part of the world. I think they're still trying to get to grips with that here, and Sanzar certainly hasn't been able to figure out how to manage that yet, because it is still the wild west when it comes to team naming. The team that's named on a Thursday or Friday doesn't need to bear any resemblance to the team that actually plays on Saturday. It's only at that 60-minute mark that they finalise their teams. And if you're a manager and a coach, and Dave Rennie was really, really good at this last season, why wouldn't you take advantage of that? If I don't have to name the team that's representative if it's on Saturday, then I'm going to be naming Sonny Bill Williams every week and then pulling him at about Saturday afternoon. So it was very frustrating to managers, and it was really refreshing to see the Premiership. You knew exactly who was playing, and there was very rarely was there any injuries, and they were genuine injuries, right? They were injuries in the warm-up that actually happened post the lockout. But the one other thing that was really interesting, there's lots of, I say lots, there's 2 or 3 players that made front rows really, really valuable. So the Wasps front row and the Sale front row. So they had Ashley Johnson and Cameron Neild playing at blindside flanker a lot. So they would sit on the bench and they would come on, and clearly then the person who owns the Wasps and the Sale front row have a significant advantage. Now we've seen it where, say, locks play loose forward, and we've seen it, midfielders play fullback, that type of thing. But we hadn't never seen a hooker playing blindside, or at least so regularly playing blindside in the Super Rugby. So that was an interesting quirk, and it made the Wasps front row very, very valuable. But yeah, just in summary, it's a very engrossing competition. You need to be very aware of team naming and the strategy of the teams and where they sit in other competitions, so that likelihood of players playing 50 minutes versus players playing 80 minutes. Versus Super Rugby, you just pretty much play the ball in front of you. So yeah, that's the Premiership. So looking at the Fantasy Rugby Draft product in 2017, do you want to run us through a couple of the new things, or the main change that we're going to have for both Super Rugby and Aviva?
Sure. I would say probably the biggest one is the change away from a game week lock, which is where all the matches for the entire weekend would lock at, say, 7 o'clock on a Friday night. The change now is heading to a game lock, which means that the players that are playing in a particular match are locked 5 minutes before the kickoff of that match, which means that you can be switching players in and out of your lineup right until the time 5 minutes before they actually play. Which is it's a massive change, and it's probably the number one thing I think that people were asking about and complaining about when it worked against them in the situations. I mean, you've just talked there about team naming, and that was a key one, and it'd be somebody like Sonny Bill Williams who's all set to play in a match and would be pulled from the starting lineup before kickoff, having been earlier named in the team, and you'd have no warning of it a lot of the time. And then you'd just be going in with an empty spot. So that's not going to happen now if, of course, you are on the ball and you're there before that kickoff time and looking out for it. So it's going to be a big deal for players that are perhaps under an injury cloud going in. Mm-hmm. And obviously those players being pulled through the warm-up. So if you're aware of the team that's named, you've got time now to find a replacement, and hopefully you've got a backup plan ready somewhere on your bench. The other things I think that are really key about this is the number of times last year where we talked about the weather in a certain location, and we'd say, you got to keep an eye on the weather in Durban, but that game's like on a Sunday morning or in New Zealand time Saturday night. How are you going to, okay, great, you keep an eye on it, but what are you going to do? You have to make your decision on Friday night, hours in advance of that. So you had no idea. At least now, right up until the time it can be kicking off. If you're attending that match, great. You could be sitting there in the stadium, checking out the atmospheric conditions and giving your meteorology report, and then switching your player out on your phone while you're right there. So that's another way. I think one of the other things I think that we could see a bit more of that wouldn't have been possible in the past was getting to the end of the game week and having perhaps the person that you're matched up against, and I guess we should probably stress that again, is that each week you're playing against one other team in your league. You could get to the business end of that matchup and realize that you need a certain number of points to win. And in that situation, you might say, okay, well, I've got two options here of guys I could play, and one of them might be the safe pair of hands. And that might be somebody who's going to get you, say,
Dane Haylett-Petty.
Dane Haylett-Petty. That's the ultimate safe pair of hands. And, we just call him Dane Haylett Safe Hands or something. We'll come up with something. But basically, he'll get you sort of 5 to 15 sort of points, maybe somewhere in that range. Mm-hmm. So that's fine. If you need 5 points, he'll get you 5 points. If you needed 25 points and you had, say, someone like Nayara Voro, mm-hmm. then it might be a better option. We know he can be devastating, but at the same time, we know that from last season, he was also prone to the odd brain explosion.
Good at sitting on those little chairs.
Yeah, yeah. No, they're normal sized chairs. He's just
true. Sorry.
Yeah, and just killing you in that way. So you might say, well, if I need the 5 points, I'll go with Dane Haylett-Petty. But if I need the 25, then I might be better off going to Nayara Voro. So you might actually find that having that ability to switch out could influence your decision making towards the end of a matchup. And of course, that just wouldn't have been possible if you were doing it and hadn't set your lineup 2 days beforehand. So I think that's another aspect to it. And of course, we're talking a lot about switching out players in your own team, but there's also the aspect for other people in the league who aren't directly affected by a player pulling out. So you might be running with a particular option at fly half. Let's say you've got Quade Cooper, and he's playing for the Reds, and he's away playing in perhaps Invercargill or something, and you run with him every week and you play him every week because he's your number one fly half, and that's great. But there could be a situation that, let's say Richie Mo'unga got pulled just before kickoff, like in a game, on that same weekend. You might, if you were on the ball, maybe go out and get Marty McKenzie, and he could potentially become a match winner for your team, and you'd actually put him in ahead of Quade Cooper. That might make sense in that scenario. So it's actually, you can be on the ball about players in other people's teams as well, and that could actually work to your advantage. Sure. And I think probably the final thing is, I think we'll probably see a spike now in drunken last minute decisions. Because games on a Friday night, obviously, a game lock on a Friday night, you might have had got a few under the belt by that point, but now, at any point in that weekend, because obviously with the time difference, we could be talking about games in South Africa kicking off at 1, 2 in the morning. You could be coming home with a skinful and be making those kinds of decisions then. So that could have some interesting consequences as well.
Yeah, I liken it to more fantasy, more stress, and more time to screw it up. One other thing, so we usually did our waiver wire processing at 8 o'clock on Tuesday night. We're going to shift that to an overnight process now, because that was keeping a few people off the site, and it also didn't allow people to access to their teams at that time when we're running the waiver wire. So we're putting it quite early in the morning on Wednesday morning, but it should finish sometime around about 7 or 8 in the morning, depending on obviously how many people are playing and how many requests go in. But that then evens it up to allow both South Africa, UK and New Zealand and Australia roughly about the same time. They should be able to have access to free agents when the waiver wire finishes. One of the biggest, there's something every year, right? Like for fantasy rugby, we've had to deal with World Cups, we've had to deal with Rio. There's all sorts of variations that haven't just made it easy to say who's a good player, play him. This season it's the Lions Tour, so it's quite significantly screwed up some playoff matchups, and in and around the playoffs, Sansa have done themselves proud here by putting the Hurricanes Chiefs Gameweek 16 match in the middle of Gameweek 15. So what we've had to do is we've had to remove that altogether, and we don't have that game in Gameweek 16, but we also don't have any New Zealand teams, and we don't have the Lions, Sharks and the Cheetahs. So there's a big swathe of teams. There's only 5 matches in that second week of the semi-final, and as kind of perchance would have it, the teams that aren't playing are the ones that you would more than likely see a lot of your fantasy players in. So as I said, the New Zealand teams, the Lions, Sharks and Cheetahs, they're stacked full of fantasy players that are probably going to get you to that point. What's your thoughts there, Mossman? Because we walked through this quite significantly in the preseason. We just couldn't see another way of doing this.
Yes. So just to clarify, so the Gameweek 16 is the final of the competition?
No, Gameweek 16 is the second leg.
Is the second leg of the semi.
That's right. So the final's fine.
So does that mean that Chiefs and Hurricanes players will not feature at any point during the semi?
No, they play. They do play in the first game week, Gameweek 15. It's just that their Gameweek 16 is taken off the board. So they play one game less than every other team in the competition. They would have played 2 game weeks. We tried to shoehorn them into Game Week 15 so that they played twice, because they play twice effectively in the time frame of Game Week 15, but it's called a Game Week 16.
Okay, all right. So it does influence my thinking if I've got players that are perhaps I think are a similar value, and as an example, it might be going right to the top, I guess, Beauden Barrett and Richie Mo'unga, and I think in terms of their output this season, they'll be quite similar, but I would put Richie ahead, based pretty much on this, and possibly also just the Lions tour generally, which I'm sure is probably something that you want to touch on as well.
I do. So, as we record this on the 18th of January, it's not clear exactly how teams are going to be managed and how the All Blacks have asked each of the individual Super Rugby franchises to prepare for the Lions, and which one of those top tier players are not going to be playing in, say, Game Week 15, which is the first leg of your semi-final. So you certainly have to be mindful about that. hopefully we get a little bit of clarification between now and when your draft day might be, which is another reason why we say your draft date should be as close to the start of the competition as possible. But I'm not 100% convinced we will. I don't think we'll get more information from the NZRU. They're notoriously tight-lipped about this type of thing. So I suspect you're going to have to, as you said, if you're... A good example for me when I was going through the rankings was I couldn't really split Lindaho and TJ Perenara. But just because the Hawaris play all through the playoffs, but they also have a really good playoff schedule, I just split the hairs and went with him. I've gone with Lindaho. I don't think it shifts, 10 ranking spots, but I think if you've got like a bunch of 3 or 4 players that you're trying to figure out and you've worked out that these are within your tiers, this could be a deciding factor. But it also could be that you get to game week, say 13 and 14, and you start wheeling and dealing, and folks get a bit desperate at that time just to make the playoffs. So you could strike at that point. But what would you do? And if you're just thinking, if you're looking at your draft and you're in the back of your mind about the Lions tour, how much of an influence do you think that would be for you?
I don't think I'm going to let it influence me too much.
Yeah, I don't think so either.
Because for the start, you've got to make the playoffs before you can start wondering about any of this other stuff.
Yep.
And there might be things during the season that obviously you can trade, and you might be in a position where if you've got these top players and they've got you that far, you might be able to actually trade them away for somebody with a more advantageous schedule, but you've got to be in that position first.
Yeah, 100%. You've got to make the dance, right?
That's right.
That's the aims. One of the things that a lot of managers have said to us is that they want to find an active league. So obviously, if you want to join a league and you don't have a hell of a lot of mates, you can jump on the site and there's some public leagues up there that you can join. Now, they're fairly notorious for not necessarily having the greatest participation, and managers do drop off quite quickly in those scenarios. So what we're trying to do is we've got a Facebook group called the Fantasy Rugby Draft Hall of Fame. So join there. If you're a league that's got only 9 players and you're looking for that extra one person, drop a post on that wall there. And likewise, if you're a player that you want to play in a competitive league, chuck your name up there as well, because there's plenty of leagues and plenty of conversations going around there at the moment around players that want to find homes and vice versa. And we're trying to bridge that gap to make sure that, because there is nothing more frustrating than having Israel Folau sitting on a flat team and not doing anything. That's probably about all we have for today. I wanted to just, we talked about that stat of Aaron Cruden previously. Did you read the other stat that he put out?
I didn't.
Okay, this is a good one for you. So we said about the percentage of passes from a fly half that went to the try or a line break. Who do you think that might be for non-fly halves? Who do you think would top that list? It's a tricky one, but it is a fan favourite.
Okay, so this is basically somebody... Okay. Do you want to give me a position as a hint?
Yep, I can. He plays in the midfield. You might have to think back to podcast last year. He was a bit of a cult hero.
Is it Holla Hollow?
Yep.
You just had to find a way to shoehorn his name in. That's perfect.
Job done. Podcast over. 28.5%. When I saw that this morning, when you tweeted that, my eyes lit up.
Yeah, absolutely.
Next on the list was Nadolo, and third on the list was SP Murray.
Interesting. Nadolo, I can understand that.
Yep, absolutely. So Willis Holla Hollow, who no longer trots the hallowed turf of the Cake Tin. Shame. All right, so that's about it. The kind of podcast schedule for the pre-season. We're going to do a rankings podcast next week. We're going to look at individual rankings, and then we'll put them up on the site. And as Mossman alluded to, we've got a few theories that we want to run through, a few contrasting theories. We'll also do the individual country rankings. We'll get Brendan Nell on. We'll get Rich Freeman. We'll have a hopefully chat to the Gaga folks, Green and Gold Rugby folks, and Reg and those guys. And we're working on getting some talent, I guess what they call it in the industry, on for the New Zealand and the Hawaris. Again, we'll get Kuchitown on. He's going to produce his Drafting 101 article, and he'll look at some sleepers and some busts that are going to be on there. And then we'll probably finish up doing an average draft position podcast, and that'll be really close to most people's draft dates. So we want to give you, we want to pull out some players that are clearly other folks are either higher on than us or lower on than us. And in season, what we're going to look to do is a Sunday podcast, an immediate reaction, a knee jerk, if you will. And then we're probably going to shelve the Thursday or Friday podcast because we didn't think we had enough value, and all the teams weren't added at that time as well. So what we're going to do is our Facebook Live. We're going to continue on that, and we're going to do a start bench session every Friday night at 6:30 New Zealand time. So if you're kind of 50% on the fence about who you should start in your midfield or outside back, or you've got 3 players to pick from 4, then jump on there and we'll ask those questions. But we'll bring those up a little bit closer to the time as well. But that's roughly our schedule that we want to walk through. Quick reminder of how you can get in touch with us. It's support@fantasyrugbydraft.com. Send through your theories, send through your rankings. We'd love to hear from the managers. It's great having a chat to them. Again, on Twitter, it's at Fantasy Rug Draft. That's Fantasy RUG Draft. And we're also on Facebook as well. We obviously do quite a bit of different things. So Twitter's more related to instant news, whether it's team news, injuries, reactions. Facebook's more about, here's an article or here's a video. I think we've got a little bit of content around our rankings that we did down in the pub last week. So we're going to put that on the side as well. But that goes in places like Facebook as well. But that's enough for now. Thanks for listening. I'm Bruce Wilkinson. He's Nathan Mossman.
Gonna miss you, Willis.
Thank you, Repeater.